Welcome to Pulsegate Gaming, where we talk about everything tabletop related. Today we'll be talking about all the miniatures that you need to buy because can you call yourself a tabletop gamer if you're not spending thousands of dollars every month on plastic? We're going to talk about the hundreds of paints that you should have or you can't paint anything. And we'll talk about the different painting methods, all of which take at least 15 hours to paint one miniature because we all know all you have is time. Or we can talk about none of those things, and we can just talk about the things that make tabletop gaming fun. Come on. With this being the first episode of the channel, I wanted to talk about something that was a big deal for me. I remember being a kid and going to the local game shop in my city and buying magic cards because I love playing Magic. And I remember always seeing the Warhammer figures on the shelves and on the racks. And the guy who owned the store, he would actually paint the armies, and so he had this giant display case with a fully painted army, and he was always painting when you went into the shop. And it always just kind of gave me this cool feeling of something that I wanted to do. And the only thing that held me back was the fact that as a 8-9-year-old kid, I didn't have $6-7 for a figure every single time. And if you wanted an army, it would cost you hundreds of dollars. Then you had to buy the paints and everything else. And so it was something at the time that I couldn't participate in. But then I grew up and I started getting adult money and things started to change. And so I wanted to get into that again. But even with adult money, I have the bills that I have. I have a family responsibility. And so money is still a little tight. And then came along 3D printing. And so that is something that I wanted to talk about because I jumped on the 3D printing train and bought myself an FDM printer. A couple years ago, I bought myself an Elegoo Neptune 2. And printers change everything. Because now I can print a miniature for D&D, a miniature for a war game. And that figure is only going to cost me 10, 15 cents. Depending on the printer you use, it could be a little higher or a little lower. But because of 3D printers, I'm able to participate in that world a lot more than I ever thought possible. And I hope that there are a lot of you out there like me who have decided to go that route, decided to participate in 3D printing, which in and of itself is a hobby and definitely not the easiest one at times. But through this channel, I hope to show you how I use a 3D printer, how you can use a 3D printer, and how to get by without one. It's not something that you have to have. It just makes tabletop gaming easier, especially when you're like me and you're trying to design your own game. Wartop gaming is incredible and is fun. And when you start designing your own pieces and things like that, you can go as far as you want to go. Okay, so let's go over the two types of printers that you're going to be dealing with and seeing the most, especially when it comes to working with the tabletop. These two different types of printers are FDM printers and resin printers. FDM printers are printers that use a giant spool of plastic. And what it does is that it feeds this plastic down into a heated nozzle and just kind of prints. When you think of 3D printing, that's generally what I think of when you see like the 3D printers for houses and things like that. That's basically what it is. They're using concrete instead of plastic, but same principle. FDM printers are awesome because they are cheap. You can use them to make most things. A roll of filament that you can put on there costs anywhere from $10 to $45, and the filament is different colors, different thicknesses, a whole bunch of different things that you can play around with and change. And so it makes 3D printing really versatile with the FDM printer. And overall, FDM printers are cheap. When I'm talking about printing a miniature, something like this, just this little werewolf miniature that I printed not too long ago. You're looking at 6, 7, 8 cents for a miniature, which if you're looking to print armies, that's great. For $1, you can have 10 miniatures, and so people love that. FDM printing is something that I really like because when I first started out, the printer itself was $169. My printer was an Elegoo Neptune 2, and it's been a great printer. The standard printer that most people see is the Creality Ender 2. There's Ender 3s. There's all these different models of each one now, and each one's a step up from the other, but the base model is probably the Ender 2 and the Elegoo Neptune 2. And of course, there's a ton of other brands out there, but those are the ones that I know the most about. And anyway, when I bought mine, it was $169. I think now they're $175, $180, something like that, but not too much. So you can buy a printer and a spool of filament for about $200 and start printing. Okay, but I don't want you to think that it's something that you can just jump into and just plug and play and go. FDM printing is one of those things that it takes time. There's a lot of things to learn. The learning curve for it is a little steep. If I had to give you a learning curve for resin and FDM printing, it would look something like this. And we'll explain that a little bit more later. But FDM printing is cheap. It is slow. Keep that in mind as well. But you can make enormous things. Whereas with resin printing, you're kind of confined to the size of the printer that you buy. Yeah, you can break things up into pieces and things like that. But by the time that you print a house or something for your D&D table, you're looking at $10 in FDM versus $50, $60 in resin. And so it's one of those things that you kind of have to gauge what you want to do. Now, the detail that you get with FDM is less. There's no way around it. Can you fine-tune your settings so much that you can print miniatures and they look great? Yes. Will they ever look as good as resin? No, they won't. You can get close. You can get really close. If all you're doing is D&D and you want to just print out characters and things like that, an FDM printer is fine. It's perfect. It'll get you what you want, especially if you're not held to the height restrictions that you would with tabletop gaming. You have your 32 millimeter figures, and you have to have them 32 millimeter. But if you're just printing for D&D, make them a little bigger. If you make them a little bigger, the detail can be really, really good, especially if you go down to a smaller nozzle, slower times, and things like that. But if you're printing to the best of your FDM printer's abilities, one miniature is going to take you 2 days, if not longer, because you got to go to a smaller nozzle. You have to go super slow when you print and things like that. And so FDM printing is great, but it has its flaws. Now, resin printing, same thing. The printer itself, a little more expensive. The resin that you have to buy, resin is just like, it's a liquid. And basically what you do is you pour that liquid into a vat, into a tub, and then light flashes on it from below, and it pulls it in and out of this light. And as it goes in and out of the light, it hardens the resin. The beauty in resin is that you can achieve that hyper detail that you want. You can get these beautiful, clear, see-through things that make, the models fantastic. And printing small is not a problem. Printing to that 32 millimeter height is not a problem. With resin, it's kind of what you're preferring to do. And when it comes to the ease of learning how to print, resin is by far easier. If I had to say one of these was a plug and play thing, resin. You might have a couple little hook or hang-ups along the way, but once you learn how to use it, it's pretty straightforward. It's pretty simple. Now, as we're talking about ups and we're talking about downs, the downsides of resin is the chemicals. Resin is a chemical like any other. It has fumes. It can be dangerous. You don't want your kids around it. You don't want your kids drinking it, or anything like that. You don't want people to be around it that it can cause a problem with. And cleanup. everything you print comes out and it's covered in this liquid. You have to take it out of the resin. You have to clean it off with alcohol. And then once you've got it all nice and clean and dried, you have to harden it one more time with light. So just straight UV light. And so the FDM printer is nice because it's just a printer and your FDM and your filament, right? Your filament that you put on the printer and you print. And yeah, it will print like a skeleton to hold up your miniature. And you have to break that off and you have to clean that up afterwards. And sometimes, that can be a little bit of a nightmare and take some time. But once that's done, you're done. The miniature is done. With resin, you have to clean it. You have to cure it again with the light. You have to have the printer, the resin, the alcohol, a straight UV light, gloves, a bunch of different stuff. I don't want that to deter you from printing with resin. It's really simple. It doesn't take a lot to learn how to do it. Cleaning it up generally isn't that big of a deal. You just need to make sure you have a nice space to do it and that, it's kept out of the reach of anyone that it could hurt. But once you have that done, you're up, you're going, you're printing. Now, we talked about costs a little bit earlier. When you're talking about printing a miniature for your tabletop game, whatever that may be, in the 32 millimeter height, FDM, like I said, is about 6 cents. Resin is probably going to cost you closer to 25 cents for that same thing, which doesn't seem like much. And because resin prints with light and just kind of goes up and down, it prints every single level at the same time. So it doesn't matter if you're printing 1 miniature or 10 miniatures, they will print in the same amount of time, which makes making an army really cool because instead of printing 1 and it takes 2 days, then you're done with that and you move on to the next one and it takes 2 days, you can print 10 in 4 hours and be done. And with some of the newer printers, it's faster than that. If you're printing something big, yeah, it can take 10, 11, 12 hours, but almost anything you start printing at night will be done by the morning. And so it is ultimately faster as far as the two printers go. And again, you cannot beat that quality of resin. So both printers have their benefits. Me, I'm a firm believer in using both. That way when you have something large that you want to print, you can do the big things in your FDM and then do the things that you want hyper detailed, like the face of your dragon, in resin. And then you just combine them together and you have a mini. And now this dragon, that if you printed all in resin, would have cost you, let's be honest, $15, $10, $15, something like that. You print it this way and it ends up only costing you $3, $4. So does that mean you should go out and get both printers? No, I do not think so. I originally just had my FDM printer and a friend of mine had his resin printer and we helped each other. I mean, ideally that's what you want to do, is have somebody with one and you have the other and you just help each other out. He needs some buildings, great, you can print those buildings. You need a couple miniatures, he can help you out with those miniatures. Or whatever you want to do. If you want to get both, that's totally fine. But ideally, pick the one that's going to serve your purpose. Can you print anything for either hobby in either printer? Yes, I've seen it done. I have seen, Warhammer Space Marine substitutes in the same height printed that look really good on an FDM printer. And I have seen large houses printed on a resin printer. I've seen boats, I've seen spaceships printed in a resin printer. And they look so good. Is it worth the cost to me? No. No, it's not. But if it's worth it to you, then do it. With this being the first video that I wanted to make about tabletop gaming, I wanted to just get into the whole aspect of 3D printing. Are we always going to talk about 3D printing? No, we're going to talk about it a lot because it's something I know a lot about, but also, it's something that has made tabletop gaming a reality for me. And it's something that I love to do. I love the hobby of 3D printing. I think it's fun. Do you have to just make things for the tabletop? No. You can make mugs, you can make props, you can make anything that you want. The limit is your imagination, right? But as far as tabletop gaming goes, it is something that has brought tabletop gaming alive in a way that wasn't possible for me before. And so it's something that I love to do. For those of you who are looking at getting a 3D printer, ultimately you need to decide what is important to you. If the way that your miniature looks, the quality of your miniature is what is important to you, then you're going to want to go with a resin printer. Is it going to be more expensive in the long run than an FDM printer? Yes, absolutely. But the quality will be the best. There will be nothing short of quality. And if you're making miniatures, you can pop them out every 4 or 5 hours. And if you're making armies, it's definitely faster. But if you're looking at making buildings, making ruins, making the dungeons that your characters are going through, an FDM printer is going to be the way that you want to go. It's just going to be cheaper. You can make an entire dungeon for, $50, $60 instead of $150, $200. And the pieces are durable, the pieces are light. And can you make miniatures? Yes. Again, if you size them up a little bit, not 32, but maybe 40 millimeters, 45 millimeters, 50 millimeters, something like that, you'll get really good quality. You can get really good quality. It will take a long time to print. But ultimately, it's up to you. The FDM option is always going to be the cheaper option. Moving forward with a printer and filament enough to create every member in your party and a building or two, you're looking at under $200. Whereas with a resin printer, and you'll be over that in resin alone. But the hobby is fun. The community is fantastic. There are people out there asking a million questions. Certain things I haven't seen, and so I want to post videos about those as well. And so I will do that with time. With that being said, a hobby shouldn't cost you your life. I looked into building a 4,000 point army or a 2,000 point army with Warhammer. And by the time you buy the rule books, the units, the paints, and everything you need to do just to get your army ready, you're $800 in. And I don't know about you, but I don't have $800 to throw around, at least not in one go. If I saved up, could I do it? Yeah. Any of us could. But for me, it was a smarter investment to pay the $200 and then, every month or two I get another roll of filament for $15, $20 and I make what I need. And I've made buildings, I've made castles, I've made trees, I've made scenery, I've made everything that I thought was necessary and everything I've needed to bring D&D alive. I play with a lot younger audience. I play with my kids. And just being able to say, this is your character, this is who you are, has made the game easier for them. It's like a board game where they're moving their piece around, and they get to decide where they're going to be when they attack the big bad guy. And they also get to see the big bad guy. It's something that I've printed out and created, and I can show to them and say, hey, this is who you're fighting. What are you going to do? And so for me, it was totally worth it. It brought it alive and made it fun for me and for them. And being able to, look back at your adventures and not just remember them, but see them. See the world and the characters you created. It makes being a DM 100 times more worth it than I ever thought it would be. Having these little pieces of art that I get to keep and can return sometimes, and just get to show people what I've made. And so for me, that has made all the difference. Like I said, going forward with this channel, we'll talk about painting. We'll talk about more printing. I have a lot of ideas, a lot of things I want to throw out there. So please, like, subscribe, stay tuned for the next adventure. And until then, this is Pulsegate Gaming.